The sun was still climbing over the far edge of the valley when the cowboy rode into the quiet stretch of land, where the creek curved through the cottonwood trees. It was one of those calm mornings on the old American frontier when the world felt still, as if holding its breath. The cowboy had been riding since dawn, dust on his boots, hunger in his stomach, and a tired look in his eyes that came from too many weeks alone on the trail. He was searching for strayed cattle near the hills earlier, but nothing had shown up except the faint hoofprints that disappeared into sand. He kept riding anyway because a man on the frontier knew he had to keep moving even when answers did not come. The land around him was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that made a man rest. It was the kind that made him alert. The grass barely moved, the breeze only whispered, and the birds kept their distance. The cowboy slowed his horse near the creek to let it drink. He leaned back in his saddle, stretching his shoulders and taking a long breath of the cool air drifting over the water. He figured he had the place to himself. Cowboys rarely met anyone out here except a few hunters or trappers, and even they avoided this side of the valley. Folks said the land near the creek belonged to Apache families who used the area during the warmer months. The cowboy had no intention of bothering anyone. He just wanted a moment of peace before pushing on. He dismounted and walked closer to the water, thinking to splash his face. But before he reached the bank, he heard something that made him freeze. It was soft, like hushed voices carried by water. He stepped back behind a tree and listened again. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Someone was there. Not one person, but several. He peeked carefully between the branches, expecting to see travelers or maybe hunters. Instead, the sight almost made him lose his footing. There in the shallow curve of the creek were 3 Apache women, standing in the clear water, their long dark hair moving with the gentle current. They were talking quietly to each other, unaware of his presence. For a moment the cowboy felt rooted to the ground, unsure what to do. He knew enough about the frontier to understand that stumbling upon an Apache bathing place could turn dangerous fast. A single wrong move could bring trouble. He took a quiet step back, intending to leave without making a sound, but fate had a way of turning simple moments into unexpected stories. Before he could retreat, his boot nudged a dry branch on the ground. It snapped louder than he wished. He held still, feeling a tightness rise in his chest. One of the women turned her head at the sound. The cowboy did not dare move or breathe as she looked toward the trees. For a second he hoped she would ignore it. But instead she raised her hand, signaling something to the others. They stopped talking and listened. The cowboy knew he had 2 choices. He could try to slip away and hope they dismissed the sound as an animal. Or he could step out and show himself, letting them see he meant no harm. Running would only make him look guilty if they caught sight of him anyway. And he had no desire to frighten them. These lands were theirs long before cowboys rode through. His father had taught him to respect that dot, so he stepped forward slowly, hands lifted to show he carried no threat. The women stiffened in surprise, their eyes widening as they saw him. They did not scream or reach for weapons. Instead, they watched him with a mix of caution, confusion, and curiosity. The cowboy tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He cleared it gently and said he was only passing through, that he heard the creek and came to water his horse. Not knowing anyone was there, the tallest woman tilted her head slightly, as if measuring the truth in his words. Another one stepped a little behind her, more wary. The third watched him with an expression he could not fully understand. They exchanged quiet words among themselves, the water rippling around them with every small movement. The cowboy waited, feeling the tension build inside him. He had met Apache men before in trade camps, but this was different. He was standing alone, uninvited, before 3 women in a place that clearly belonged to them. He kept his voice steady as he repeated that he meant no harm. His horse pawed the ground behind him, picking up the unease in the air. The women did not approach him, but they did not tell him to leave either. Their silence added to the uncertainty of the moment. The cowboy was not sure what they were thinking. Were they deciding if he was a threat or wondering why he had not run? A lot could go wrong on the frontier from a single misunderstanding. He knew that well. He lowered his gaze out of respect, staying still, giving them space to decide how this encounter would go. The creek continued moving between them, a thin line of clear water that felt like a border neither side wanted to cross. The cowboy felt the weight of the land around them, the kind of weight that came when two worlds met in the middle of a quiet morning. One of the women finally stepped forward just a little, only enough to show she was the one willing to speak for the group. She asked him why he did not turn back earlier when he heard voices. Her tone was not accusing, but careful. The cowboy answered honestly. He said he thought it would be wrong to slip away like a thief. He wanted them to see him clearly and know he had no intentions that would cause fear or trouble. His voice softened as he spoke, hoping they understood. The woman studying him did not look away. Her eyes carried a strength he respected. She asked where he was headed. He explained he was searching for cattle, traveling alone until he reached the next settlement. The women listened, exchanging glances again. Their expressions shifted in a way he could not fully read, like they knew something he did not. A small breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of wild mint from the creek bank. The cowboy started to take a slow step back, wanting to give them privacy. But the woman raised her hand slightly, stopping him. Her gesture was gentle, not threatening. He held still, unsure why she wanted him to stay. The other two watched him with interest now instead of fear. Something in their posture changed, as if his calmness had affected them in a way none expected. Then the woman asked him a question he did not see coming. She asked if he had seen any riders near the hills earlier that morning. Her tone carried concern, not for herself, but for something else. The cowboy felt a chill inside. He told her he had not seen riders, only the faint hoof prints in the sand. The three women shared a worried look, and the tallest one stepped closer, the water swirling around her legs. She told him they were not alone in this valley today. Someone else had entered their land earlier, someone who should not be here. The cowboy felt the shift in the air, the sudden seriousness settling between them. He asked who it was, but she hesitated before answering. The other two looked toward the trees as if expecting danger to walk out at any moment. The cowboy felt the tension rise, stronger now than before, and for the first time he wondered if this encounter had happened for a reason. The woman opened her mouth to speak, ready to tell him what they feared, but before she could finish, a sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the valley, sharp enough to make all three women turn at once. The cowboy spun toward the noise, his heartbeat quickening. He could tell by their faces that whatever they were expecting had finally arrived, and now he realized he might be caught in the middle of something far more dangerous than an innocent meeting at the creek. The sharp sound echoed again, rolling through the quiet valley like a warning no one could ignore. The cowboy felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as the three Apache women exchanged tense glances. The tallest one stepped a little out of the creek, the sunlight catching on the edge of the water around her legs. There was something in her expression that told him this was not a small worry. It was something deeper, something tied to the land and the people who lived on it. The cowboy kept his voice low as he asked what that sound meant. The woman closest to him shook her head slightly as if unsure whether she should answer. She looked toward the trees again, the same direction the noise had come from. The other two women moved closer to her, almost in an instinctive way, forming a small circle of alertness. There was no panic on their faces, but there was caution, the kind that came from knowing danger before it arrived. The cowboy stepped to the side, giving them space, but he stayed close enough to hear. He knew from the stories he grew up with that the frontier held more than weather and wildlife. Sometimes it held trouble of the kind that did not carry kindness in its shadow. He waited, feeling the weight in the air grow heavier. The sunlight seemed dimmer, even though the sky was clear. The tallest woman finally spoke. She told him that riders had passed through the valley at sunrise, moving quickly and leaving signs that were not familiar to anyone from their camps. She said the hoof prints the cowboy saw were likely from those same riders. She added that the land around the creek had been quiet for weeks, with no hint of strangers until now. Her voice carried a mix of concern and distrust, not toward the cowboy, but toward whoever else had entered their territory. The cowboy thought back to the faint tracks he saw near the ridge. He remembered how the ground looked disturbed, as if someone rushed through instead of traveling with purpose. He had assumed it was a lone wanderer. Now he realized he should have paid more attention. He wished he had followed the trail longer, even if it meant losing time. He asked the woman if she knew who the riders might be. She hesitated again, then said they feared it could be men searching for something they should not have. She did not explain what that meant, leaving the cowboy more curious than before. The other two women kept looking around with sharp eyes, listening to the wind and the trees as if the land itself might warn them. The cowboy's horse snorted and shifted restlessly. It sensed the tension as strongly as he did. He walked back to calm it, placing a hand on its neck. As he soothed the animal, he kept glancing toward the women, trying to read their expressions. They seemed torn between speaking and staying silent. He could tell they were not used to trusting strangers easily. The woman who had been doing most of the talking finally walked a few steps closer to the bank. The water clung to her ankles as she moved, her hair falling down her shoulders. She asked the cowboy why he was alone in this part of the valley. He explained how he had been searching for missing cattle for days and had taken a different trail that morning, wanting to check the creek area before riding back to the plains. He added that he had not expected to find anyone here, especially not three women in a quiet place like this. Her eyes softened for a moment as she listened. She exchanged a few quick words with the other two, who nodded subtly. Then she looked back at him and said their camp was not far from the creek. They came here early in the morning to avoid being seen because the land had felt unsettled since the strangers arrived. She paused, studying him again, as if trying to decide how much to share. She said the riders might be closer than anyone wanted. The cowboy felt the chill return despite the warm air. He asked if they needed help, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she asked him something unexpected. She wanted to know if he believed the land held signs before danger came. The cowboy thought about the quiet morning, the birds that had not sung, the uneasy feeling that followed him since sunrise. He said sometimes the land whispered warnings if a man paid attention. Her expression showed that was the answer she hoped to hear. She then told him something in a calm but serious tone. She said the valley had been peaceful for a long time until recently. A few nights ago, their scouts heard strange noises near the eastern ridge. Not animal sounds, but voices of men who did not speak like the nearby settlers or ranchers. Their fires burned late into the night, and their horses moved restlessly as if forced to travel long distances. The scouts kept their distance, watching quietly. But when the sun rose, the strangers were gone. Leaving behind tracks too deep to be from simple travel, the cowboy listened carefully. He knew enough about frontier life to understand the meaning behind deep tracks. It meant riders moving quickly, carrying weight, maybe supplies or stolen goods. Or it meant riders heading toward something they were determined to reach. He felt a knot in his stomach as he thought about all the trouble that could come from men who traveled like that. The woman continued. She said yesterday their scouts found a torn piece of cloth snagged on a bush near the ridge. The cloth was not from Apache clothing or any settler nearby. It was thicker, rougher, the kind used by men who traveled far or carried caravans. They feared these strangers were not simply passing through. They feared they had come looking for something hidden in the valley, something old and tied to their people. The cowboy wanted to ask what that was, but the woman raised a hand softly, signaling the topic was not meant for outsiders. He respected her silence and did not push. The rustling sound came again from the trees, this time softer but closer. The cowboy felt his hand drift instinctively toward the side of his belt, not to grab anything, but to know it was there. The women all turned their heads toward the noise, breathing slower, listening. It was the kind of listening that came from people trained to read danger from the smallest shifts. The trees stood still for a moment, holding their secret. Then a bird shot out from a branch and flew across the creek. The cowboy let out a slow breath, but the women did not relax. Their eyes stayed on the trees because the earlier sound had not come from a bird. The cowboy knew they were right. The tallest woman stepped out of the water and approached the bank, keeping a steady gaze on the trees. She did not appear frightened, only focused. She told the cowboy quietly that he should not be here alone. She said the riders might not know he was harmless, and the valley had a way of trapping people who wandered into trouble without meaning to. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He did not want to become part of a conflict he knew nothing about, but it seemed fate had brought him here at the wrong moment. Or perhaps the right moment. Depending on what was coming, he noticed the way the three women moved now, closer to each other, as if preparing for something they knew well. They did not rush or panic. They simply became more aware, more alert, more ready. The cowboy admired their calm strength, but it also made him uneasy. They acted like people who had survived danger before. The woman closest to him finally spoke again. She said the strangers who entered the valley might be searching for an old trail that cut through the land, a trail known only to a few. She said her people guarded that trail because it led to places outsiders were not meant to find. She did not say what those places were or why they were protected, but her voice held enough seriousness to tell him it mattered deeply. The cowboy looked around slowly, trying to see the land the way they did. The creek seemed innocent, the trees peaceful, the hill quiet, but now he sensed something hidden beneath the surface of the valley, something old and quietly waiting. The mystery made the air feel heavier, as if the land itself knew secrets he was not meant to learn. The woman asked him if he planned to continue searching the area. He answered honestly that he did not want to bring trouble to anyone, including himself. She studied him again, then said the valley was not safe to travel alone until they understood what the strangers wanted. The cowboy sensed she was trying to warn him without making him feel unwelcome. He appreciated that. But before he could respond, the sound came again. This time it was not a crack or a rustle. It was the distant but clear thump of hooves, hitting hard ground. The women turned sharply toward the sound. The cowboy felt his pulse quicken. He realized the strangers were closer than any of them expected. And now, standing at the edge of the creek with three Apache women watching the hills with growing fear, he understood that whatever the valley was hiding was about to reveal itself in a way none of them were ready for. The sound of hooves came again, closer this time, like a drumbeat rolling along the hard ground. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He looked at the three Apache women, and they looked back at him with the same question in their eyes. What now? The valley that had felt wide and open only minutes before suddenly felt small, like a circle closing around them. The creek, the trees, the old American frontier sky above them, all of it seemed to hold its breath. The tallest woman moved first. She stepped toward the bank and spoke quickly to the others in their own language. They nodded and began to move with quiet purpose. One of them waded to the far side of the creek, heading toward the brush that led to higher ground. The second gathered a few things from the bank where they had left their clothes and belongings. Their movements were fast but controlled. They were used to sudden trouble. This was not their first time dealing with danger in this valley. The cowboy led his horse a few steps away from the water. His mind raced as he tried to decide what a man in his position ought to do. He could mount up and ride out, hope to slip away before the strangers arrived. But leaving now meant turning his back on whatever was about to happen to the people whose land he was standing on. He had already walked into their mourning uninvited. Walking out just when trouble came did not sit right with him. The woman who had spoken most of the time came closer. Her hair, still damp from the creek, clung slightly to her shoulders. There was nothing soft in her eyes now, only steady resolve. She told him the riders would likely follow the sound of water. Men who did not know the land still knew where a creek could give them rest. She said he had a choice. He could leave and look after himself, or he could stay and risk getting tangled in their fight. He asked her if their camp was in immediate danger. She nodded slightly. She said their tents and families were farther up the valley, hidden among the cottonwoods near a bend in the creek. If the riders found the old trail, they could come close without warning. Their people were not weak, but surprise on the frontier often gave the advantage to those without mercy. The cowboy thought of children, elders, cooking fires, and the quiet parts of life that did not belong anywhere near rough men with bad intentions. The sound of the hooves grew louder, the rhythm now steady. The cowboy knew they had only minutes, maybe less. He told her plainly he did not like the idea of strangers pushing into the valley looking for something they had no right to. He added that he owed her and the others at least some help after walking into their place like a fool at daybreak. She watched him with a careful gaze as if weighing his words against the danger. She then shared something more. One of their scouts, her younger brother, had gone out at night to follow the trail of those riders. He had not returned by morning. Their family feared he might have been seen, or worse. That was another reason they had been uneasy at the creek. They were waiting for news that had not come. The cowboy felt a sharp twist inside him. He thought of his own younger brother, long gone now, and how his family had waited for a rider who never made it home. The memory deepened his resolve. The closest woman said the riders were likely moving along the lower bend first, then turning toward the creek. If the cowboy moved out into the open alone, he could make it look like he was the only soul wandering the valley. The strangers might question him, maybe try to use him, but it could pull their eyes away from the hidden paths leading to the Apache camp. It was a risky idea, built on guesswork and hope. But on the frontier, most plans were. He stared at the open stretch of land beyond the trees. Meeting dangerous men alone was not something he wished for, but he had done it before. He could talk, lie a little, say he was trailing cattle and looking to move on. If he played his part well, they might ride in another direction, buying time for the women to warn their people. If he failed, there was no telling how far the trouble would spread. The woman asked if he was sure he wanted to do this. Her voice carried no softness, only straight truth. He nodded once. He said a man had to stand somewhere, and today he was standing in their valley. That made this his concern too. She studied him for a heartbeat, then gave a short nod in return. She told him they would move through the trees toward their camp and alert the others. If he could buy them even a little time, it might make the difference between surprise and readiness. She called the other two women closer. They gathered at the bank for a brief, tense moment, speaking quickly. One of them cast a final glance at the cowboy, her eyes both wary and grateful. Then they moved into the trees, disappearing almost silently into the thick brush. They knew every inch of this valley, and within seconds the only sign they had been there was the faint ripple of the creek and the disturbed grass on the bank. The cowboy mounted his horse and turned toward the open part of the valley. The hooves he heard were not far now. He rode forward at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow, making himself easy to see. He wanted the strangers to notice him before they came too close to the creek. The wide sky stretched over his head, and the sun was higher now, casting clear light over the land. Dust began to rise in the distance, a cloud moving toward him. Soon he could make out the riders. There were 4 of them. They wore worn coats and mixed bits of gear, as if they had gathered clothing from many places. Their horses looked strong, but tired, lathered from hard riding. One of the men wore an old military jacket with the buttons dull from use. Another had a long coat that flapped open as he rode, showing a belt with more than one weapon. Their faces were rough, the kind carved by travel, not by peaceful work. They slowed when they saw him, forming a loose half-circle as they approached. The leader, the one in the military jacket, raised his chin and looked the cowboy over in a way that felt like weighing cattle at auction. The cowboy kept his face calm, his posture easy, like a man with nothing to hide. He lifted a hand in a simple greeting and said he was out on the trail, looking for lost stock. The leader's voice was flat as he asked what he was doing so deep in this valley. The cowboy repeated the same story, adding a few details about strayed cattle, rocky ground, and tracks that led him this way. He made sure to sound a little frustrated, the way a tired ranch hand might. The leader's eyes did not soften. He seemed less interested in the cowboy's problem and more interested in the land around them. One of the other riders scanned the hills, while the third kept watching the creek in the distance, though from here he could not yet see where the Apache women had been. The 4th man rode a little behind, quiet and watchful, with a hard look in his eyes that made the cowboy uneasy. The leader asked if the cowboy had seen anyone else in the valley. Any camps, hunters, or travelers? The cowboy felt his heart beat harder in his chest, but his voice stayed steady. He said he had not seen anyone all morning, only a few old tracks near the ridge and the creek he was headed toward for water. He shrugged lightly, trying to appear bored with company. He said he hoped no one else was out here because he did not like sharing quiet land. When he was already in a foul mood over lost cattle, the leader studied him for another moment. Then he smiled, but it was a smile without warmth. He said a man alone on the frontier could be useful. He asked if the cowboy knew the valley well. The cowboy answered carefully, saying he had ridden through once or twice, enough to know where the creek bent and where the hills grew rough, but not enough to call himself a guide. He did not want to seem too familiar with the land. That could raise questions he did not want. The leader exchanged looks with his men. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded scrap of cloth or paper. He opened it and showed the cowboy a rough drawing, lines that marked a valley, a creek, and a narrow path cutting toward distant hills. It was a crude map, but the cowboy could tell it matched where they stood. The leader tapped a spot on the drawing and asked if the cowboy knew where that trail lay. The cowboy's throat felt dry. He recognized the general shape of the land, and the spot the leader tapped was not far from where the woman said their old trail ran, the one that led to places outsiders were not meant to find. He kept his face plain as he looked at the map, taking his time. Then he said he was not sure. The land all looked the same to him this far from town. He pointed vaguely toward the west and said he had seen some rough paths there, but he would not swear to it. The quiet rider in the back shifted in his saddle and looked toward the direction the cowboy pointed. The leader followed his gaze, thinking. Then he turned his attention back to the cowboy and asked if he would be willing to ride with them away, just to make sure they did not miss anything. The cowboy felt the trap closing. If he refused too quickly, they might doubt him. If he agreed, he risked leading them too close to the people he was trying to protect. For a brief moment, he thought of turning his horse and claiming he had to find his cattle before nightfall. But looking at their faces, he knew they were not men who took no for an answer easily. The leader's eyes held a kind of sharpness that spoke of long miles and hard choices. Men like that did not come this far into Apache land for simple curiosity. The cowboy sensed they were looking for something valuable, something hidden, and they did not care who got hurt along the way. He weighed his options in silence. The old American frontier stretching out around them like a stage waiting for the next move. Somewhere behind the trees, the three Apache women were moving fast, warning their camp. Somewhere out there, a missing young scout might be injured or captured. The cowboy knew his choice in the next few heartbeats could change what happened to them all. He forced himself to breathe slowly and lifted his eyes to meet the leader's steady stare, and just as he opened his mouth to answer, one of the riders turned his head sharply toward the creek, squinting, as if he had caught a flicker of movement among the distant trees. The rider who looked toward the creek narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward in his saddle. His horse stamped the ground, sensing the shift in his attention. The cowboy felt a tightening in his chest as he followed the man's gaze. From where they stood, the trees looked still, but he knew the Apache women had moved through that area only moments earlier. If even one branch moved the wrong way, these riders might believe something was hidden in the valley. The cowboy needed to act before suspicion took hold. He leaned forward slightly, shading his eyes as if trying to see the same thing. Then he shook his head and let out a slow breath. He told them the far side of the creek always had deer moving through at this time of morning. He said he had scared a few off on his way in. He kept his tone casual, the kind used by men who knew animals better than people. The leader looked at him for a long moment, searching for any crack in his words. The cowboy held his face calm, though his heartbeat rattled like hooves on a wooden bridge. One of the other riders muttered that he didn't see any deer, but the leader raised a hand to quiet him. He seemed torn between trusting the cowboy and pushing harder. His eyes scanned the valley again. The cowboy knew the longer they stood here, the more time the Apache camp had to prepare, but also the more chances these men had to notice something they shouldn't. Finally, the leader spoke. He said they would ride the direction the cowboy suggested earlier, toward the west ridge. But he still wanted the cowboy to ride ahead of them. Not beside them. Not behind them. Ahead. A test. The cowboy swallowed the dry knot in his throat. Riding ahead meant exposing himself first if danger appeared. It also meant if they caught him leading them away from their true target, they might turn on him quickly. Still, he nodded. He did not have a choice unless he wanted things to turn violent right there. He turned his horse slowly, as if everything was normal, and began riding toward the west. The riders followed behind him in a loose formation. The cowboy could feel their eyes on him like hot iron on his back. The land stretched out quiet around them, every little sound sharpening his focus. He scanned the ground ahead, searching for anything he could use to stall them or turn the trail without. Raising suspicion, the horse beneath him felt his tension and moved with careful steps. The cowboy kept glancing at the tracks ahead for signs of the ridge trails he remembered from old herding trips. He needed to lead the riders far enough away from the creek and hidden trails that the Apache families had time to ready their defenses, but he also needed to avoid leading the strangers into a dead end, which would make them question him. The leader called out, asking how far the rough trail was. The cowboy answered that it wasn't much farther. He kept his tone steady, though his mind worked fast, trying to plan his next move. The trees grew thinner as they approached the rocky section of the valley. The ground here was cracked and uneven, formed by years of storms and shifting land. A few pines leaned against the wind on a small rise, marking the place where the land began to climb. The cowboy slowed his horse and pointed toward the broken edges of rock ahead. He said the trail split there, one part going up the ridge and another curving deeper into the valley. He suggested they take the left path, which he remembered as the one that led nowhere special. He hoped they believed him. The riders stared hard at the two directions. The quiet one in the back studied the right path longer than the others. The cowboy felt his stomach twist. If that man noticed even the faintest sign of use on the right trail, everything could unravel. Then something unexpected happened. A faint cry echoed across the valley. It was distant but sharp, human, not an animal. The riders jerked their heads toward the sound. The cowboy froze. His heart pounded against his ribs. It came again, a short cry, carried by the wind. The leader straightened in his saddle, eyes narrowing. He turned toward the cowboy and asked if he knew what that was. The cowboy shook his head, but inside he knew what the cry meant. Someone needed help. And deep in his gut, he feared it was the missing Apache scout the women had spoken of. If he was hurt and calling out, and if the strangers believed the cry was linked to the trail they were seeking, then everything would collapse. The cowboy had to think fast. He said the valley carried sounds strangely, especially near the rocks. He suggested it might be someone hunting or calling animals. But the leader was not convinced. The riders listened again. Then the quiet one spoke for the first time. His voice was low but clear. He said the cry came from the right, the same direction of the hidden trail. The cowboy felt the tension in the air tighten like a pulled rope. The leader turned to the cowboy, suspicion building in his eyes. He asked again if he knew something he wasn't saying. The cowboy felt the weight of the question settle on him like dust during a dry storm. One wrong answer could turn the riders against him instantly. He thought of the Apache women moving through the trees. He thought of their families waiting. He thought of the missing scout who might be injured and alone. Before he could answer, the cry came a third time, clearer, closer. The riders snapped their attention toward the sound. The leader kicked his horse forward, motioning for the others to follow. They turned toward the right trail. The cowboy had no choice but to follow as well. The narrow path cut through scrub brush and led toward a lower part of the ridge. The air grew heavier as they rode. The cowboy felt each step of his horse as though he was riding toward something inevitable. The trees closed in tighter. The canyon walls on each side began to rise. It was not a deep canyon, but narrow enough to funnel sound. The cry came again, weaker, strained. They rode faster now. The cowboy tried to look calm even as his thoughts raced. If it was the scout, he needed to protect him. But he could not reveal his connection to the Apache people. If the riders sensed he cared, they might turn on him and the scout both. The leader raised his hand and slowed. He signaled the men to spread out. They dismounted quietly, scanning the rocks and brush. The cowboy dismounted too, holding his reins and trying to see through the tangled shadows. Then he spotted something near a small outcrop. A figure slumped. Still, the cowboy's breath caught. The leader followed his gaze and moved that way. His boots crunching against gravel. As they approached, they saw the figure was a young Apache man. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, and a rope was tied around his wrists. He looked exhausted, barely conscious. The cowboy's jaw tightened. The scout had been captured. But by who? The riders. Someone else. The leader crouched and checked the ground. He said the scout had been here for a short time, not long. He looked up at the cowboy sharply. He asked why an Apache scout would be alone in this part of the valley. The cowboy felt the pressure closing in around him. The men looked ready for a fight. Their hands hovered near weapons. Suspicion thickened the air. The cowboy knew one wrong word could turn this into bloodshed. He said the scout might have gotten lost or injured hunting. He kept his tone slow and uncertain, as if he was guessing. The quiet rider shook his head. He pointed out faint drag marks on the dirt and said the scout had been brought here, not wandering alone. The tension grew even sharper. The cowboy realized the riders were now fighting two dangers at once. The unknown threat that captured the scout, and the unknown parts of the valley they still didn't understand. The leader straightened and gave an order to cut the scout free. He wanted answers. He wanted someone to blame. He wanted control of the situation. The cowboy knew things were racing toward a clash. Between the riders and the Apache people. Between the strangers and whatever forces moved through the valley. Between the cowboy himself and the truth he was trying to hide. The scout opened his eyes weakly. He looked at the cowboy first, as if recognizing something in him. Then he saw the riders and tensed with fear. The leader grabbed his arm and demanded to know who had tied him up and why. The scout murmured something too soft to hear. The cowboy stepped closer and asked gently what happened, hoping the scout would not reveal anything that could turn the riders against the Apache camp. The scout's gaze drifted toward the deeper part of the canyon, trembling with fear. His breathing quickened. He tried to speak, but the words broke in his throat. The cowboy leaned in, catching only a fragment of whispered sound. Not them. The cowboy felt the world tilt slightly. Not them. Which meant the riders were not the ones who captured him. Something else was out here. Something neither the riders nor the cowboy nor the Apache women had fully understood. The leader heard it, too, and stiffened. He looked at the canyon walls as if expecting shadows to move. The cowboy felt the valley tighten around them. Every breath growing heavier. And then, from deep within the canyon, came a sound none of them expected, a sound that made every man freeze in place. A second set of hooves. Riding fast, riding straight toward them. The second set of hooves thundered through the canyon. Sharp and steady, echoing off the rock walls until it felt like the ground itself was shaking. Every man turned toward the sound. The cowboy's hand tightened on his reins. The riders stepped back, each one gripping his weapon. The young Apache scout struggled to sit up, fear flashing across his face. Whatever or whoever was coming was not something he wanted to face again. The cowboy felt a rush of worry for the Apache women and their camp. If the danger was worse than these strangers, it meant the valley held more secrets than he understood. The riders formed a tense semicircle, staring into the canyon's narrowing throat. Dust curled in the air as the sound grew louder. Then a shape appeared between the rocks. A horse burst forward, carrying a lone rider who was slumped forward in the saddle. The horse was wild-eyed and lathered with sweat, moving fast in pure panic rather than control. The cowboy stepped forward instinctively, raising his hands to calm the animal. The horse swerved, then slowed only when it sensed it was out of immediate danger. The rider slid sideways and fell to the ground. When the dust settled, they saw he was dressed in the same rough clothes as the group of hostile riders. The leader moved quickly to check on him. The fallen rider's breathing was ragged, his face pale. He whispered something the cowboy could barely hear. Those riders weren't alone. Someone else was watching the valley too. Someone who didn't want any outsiders here, including the hostile men beside the cowboy. As the fallen man spoke, his voice trembled with real fear. He said they had found signs that someone had been warning tribes and chasing off travelers. leaving false trails to confuse outsiders. He admitted they had been searching for an old trading route once used by Apache families long ago, but something else in the valley wanted to keep that trail hidden. Not for protection, but for its own reasons. The leader looked shaken. For the first time, the cowboy saw a hint of doubt in the man's face. He realized now that his group had stepped onto someone else's ground. Not just Apache land, but land guarded by people they didn't know. The cowboy helped the injured rider sit up against the stone. He offered him water, and the man drank in small, shaky gulps. The cowboy then turned toward the young Apache scout. He knelt beside him and asked again what happened. The scout finally managed a few more words. He said masked men had caught him in the dark, forced him toward the canyon, tied him up, and left him as bait. They wanted to draw in anyone who came searching, whether it was the hostile riders or the Apache people. They wanted chaos, not control. The cowboy felt a chill at the thought. Someone wanted this valley to turn into a battlefield. But the cowboy knew something else too. Whoever these masked men were, they were long gone now. The second rider's arrival proved they had fled after attacking, leaving fear behind to do the rest of their work. The cowboy realized the real danger had already passed, and the people standing in the canyon were the ones who still had the chance to stop more harm. The leader looked at the cowboy and asked what he thought they should do. It was a question he never expected from a man like him, but the cowboy answered simply. He said they needed to clear out of the valley, leave the trail alone, and make sure no more strangers followed in their footsteps. He added that the land belonged to the people who lived here, not to outsiders chasing stories or old secrets. The quiet rider nodded slowly, as if he had been thinking the same thing. The leader hesitated but finally gave a long breath. He knew staying here meant trouble they were not prepared for. The injured rider agreed, insisting that they should not try to follow the old trail anymore. The cowboy helped them gather what they needed, and together they supported the fallen rider onto a horse. The young Apache scout watched them with guarded eyes. Still weak, but no longer afraid of the men leaving, before they rode out, the leader turned to the cowboy. He said a man like him did not owe anything to strangers or to Apache families, yet he had stepped between the two and kept the valley from turning violent. He admitted he had misjudged him. The cowboy nodded, not needing praise. He only wanted peace left behind when he rode out. The riders took the East Pass, heading back the way they came. Their horses moved slowly, the earlier hardness in their faces replaced by caution and tired humility. When they were far enough away, the cowboy helped the scout to his feet. Together they walked back toward the creek, the scout leaning on him for support. As they reached the lower path, the trees opened and the cowboy saw movement in the brush. The three Apache women stepped out quietly. Relief washed over their faces when they saw the scout alive. The tallest woman hurried to him and touched his face gently, speaking soft words the cowboy did not understand but felt deep in the tone. She helped steady him while the other two checked his injuries. The cowboy stood back, watching the family reunite. The women thanked him with their eyes before they spoke. The tallest woman approached him and said her people would remember what he had done. She said he stood where many others would have turned away. She told him the valley was safe again. Not because danger was gone, but because people were prepared and alert. She added something else. She said the masked men would not return. Their fear was a weapon, but it worked only once. Now the tribe knew what to watch for. The scout would recover, and the land would remain theirs, protected by those who belonged to it. The cowboy felt a calm settle inside him. He knew the valley would be watched with new care, not out of fear but out of respect for what almost happened. The Apache women invited him to walk with them to the camp so their elders could thank him properly. He agreed, feeling it was right to let them know he meant no harm to their people or their land. As they traveled, he noticed the quiet beauty of the valley again. The creek flowed softly, the cottonwoods moved in the wind, and the hills rose steady against the sky. It was a reminder that the frontier held both danger and peace, depending on how a man chose to move through it. When they reached the camp, the people gathered around the scout to help him. The elders listened to what happened. They approached the cowboy and offered him water and food. They thanked him in their own language, with gestures and words that carried sincerity. The cowboy felt humbled. He said he only did what he hoped someone would do for his own family in a time of trouble. Before leaving, the tallest woman walked with him to the edge of the camp. She told him that the creek would always be a safe place again, that the fear brought by strangers had been washed away. She thanked him one last time and said that the valley had a way of remembering kindness. The cowboy mounted his horse and looked back at the camp, the creek, and the three women who had trusted him even when trust was a risk. He tipped his hat, smiled softly, and turned toward the open trail. The valley stretched behind him, quiet and strong. Once more, as he rode away, he felt something settle inside his chest. Not pride, not glory. Just a simple truth. On the old American frontier, a man's worth was measured by how he stood when others needed him. And that day he had stood in the right place. The sun dipped lower, casting warm light across the plains as he headed toward home. The wind moved gently around him, carrying the scent of pine and water. And though he left the valley behind, the memory of the creek, the Apache women, the scout, and the morning that could have ended in fire stayed with him like a quiet lesson. In a land filled with stories of danger, conflict, and hidden trails, he carried one more story now. A story of trust earned, fear overcome, and peace protected. A story where strangers became allies, and a cowboy found his path not by chance but by choice. And as he rode into the fading light, he knew this would always be one of those frontier memories that stayed with a man and guided him toward better days.